We're four friends with hot takes on food media.
And we're here to review and recap all kinds of food shows in bite-sized seasons.
Plus, virtual potlucks, cooking adventures, and food memes.
Welcome to Pod Appétit Gourmet Takes.
Thank you, Stephanie. And of course, thank you, Claire, so much for joining us. And to everyone here in the audience today, welcome to another exciting Reddit talk here on Our Food. My name is Meg, and I am joined by LJ up top. We'll be your hosts for today. We're also the hosts of Pod Appétit Gourmet Takes, a podcast that reviews and recaps all kinds of food shows in bite-sized seasons. Today, it is our true and absolute pleasure to welcome the one and only Claire Saffitz as our guest. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, we've been fans for years now, and I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening have been as well. But just in case you didn't know, Claire Saffitz is a recipe developer, cookbook author, and video host. Previously, Claire was senior food editor at Bon Appetit magazine and the BA Test Kitchen. She hosted the series Gourmet Makes on Bon Appetit's YouTube channel, using her classical pastry knowledge to reverse engineer popular snack foods and candy. Claire's all-new cookbook, What's for Dessert, just hit bookshelves. You can get copies of What's for Dessert and Claire's first cookbook, the New York Times bestseller Dessert Person, wherever books are sold. So for this live talk, Claire will be answering your questions about all things sweet. She's especially looking for questions about Thanksgiving desserts and bakes, since we're just a few days away from Thanksgiving here. So if you've never joined us for Reddit Talk before, this is how it works. For about the next hour, you get to ask Claire your questions. It's basically a live audio AMA. To ask your question, listeners, you'll want to first raise your hand by clicking the hand icon. And then if you receive an invite to come up on stage, when prompted to do so by one of us, please unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon and asking your question. So while we wait for folks to join us up on stage, I'm going to throw it to my co-host LJ for our first question.
Hi, Claire. So excited to speak with you today and talk to you about all things desserts and Thanksgiving. I was wondering if you could tell us, we all know that you're a dessert person, but you make lots of savory dishes as well. So I'm really keen to know, besides dessert, what's your absolute favorite part of the Thanksgiving menu?
Yeah, I love Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is probably my favorite food holiday. I say to people, it's like the Super Bowl for cooks. I really love starch and carbs. So I tend to really love the potato dishes on the table. So mashed potatoes. I also love, of course I love the desserts. I'm not as much into stuffing, which I think is surprising to people because it's basically like bread and stock and, dried fruit and sausage and all that kind of thing, which I love it, but it doesn't to me work as well with everything on the table. I also love the cranberry sauce. I think cranberries are such an amazing fruit. One of the only fruits that's completely native to North America, or at least the United States. So I think cranberry does so much, and I wish that we ate it throughout the year and not just at Thanksgiving. My mom always makes at least 3 or 4 different kind of cranberry chutneys and sauces because she loves it as well. So that part is also one of my favorites. And yeah, my family also makes this particular dish that is a glazed shallot recipe. It's so good, and it's shallots cooked down in white wine and butter and chicken stock until they're syrupy and soft, and it's so delicious. So yeah, it's not generally the turkey, which I know is not very many people's favorites, but even though I do like turkey, but to me it's really all about the side dishes too.
I definitely think cranberries are an unsung hero.
Yes, underrated.
I believe Two Way Split joined us first. Two Way Split, please unmute yourself, and there we go.
Sure. Hi, Claire. Thanks so much for doing this. Huge fan of Dessert Person. I recently made a recipe I saw on bonappetit.com that you published for a custard tart, and I paired it with a different recipe for whiskey poached pears, and it was delicious, both of them independently, but it didn't really feel like the two were this part of the same dessert. And I was just wondering your thoughts on like the best way to incorporate flavors into custard, if that's recommended, and if so, what you'd recommend in terms of flavored custard for Thanksgiving desserts.
Yeah, I think anytime you're pairing a fruit with another kind of component, like a custard or anything in like a custard family, like a creme brulee or a pudding or that kind of thing, I think it's important that one doesn't overpower the other. So you can try to carry flavors from one component into the other. So, if you have a vanilla bean in your custard, then maybe put a little bit of vanilla in the fruit component if possible, and that kind of ties them together. I think also, one can overpower the other. So I think maybe it was possibly the whiskey that was possibly like a little bit overpowering and dominant. I mean, pear is nice because it's a more subtle flavor, but I think also with a creamy thing, it's nice to have a component that's a little bit acidic. So something like a berry, blueberry or raspberry or that kind of thing, even cranberry if done well, although something that I think is very acidic, like citrus, might again be a little bit overpowering. So I think it's also, you can play around with the proportions. So if you feel like one is a little bit too dominant, you can just sort of change the proportion. So more, less of that fruit topping or maybe more thinly sliced or that kind of thing, where you're just getting less of it. And therefore it's kind of the custard is in a higher proportion. So that becomes sort of more of the prevailing flavor. So I think, to some extent, it's a little bit of trial and error. Just think of things that are kind of tried and true, accompaniments to custard. So if it's like goes on top of cheesecake or creme brulee or pudding or, that kind of thing, then it's pretty much a safe bet. But to some extent, it's a little bit of like trial and error. So now you like the whiskey poached pears, but maybe it's better off with something a little more assertive, or that kind of thing. Or just, you can bake them onto like some pastry and serve it with a little vanilla ice cream or something like that. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it was. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, Astasia, I think you were next in line to ask your question of Claire. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hi, Claire. I have a vanilla question. Long story short, my partner and I are cleaning out her parents' house after their passing, and they were kind of really big into gourmet cooking and baking. In one of their freezers, we found a quantity of basically they're like sealed tubes of whole organic vanilla bean, and quite a lot of them. The rub is that basically we think that the power's gone out in the place at least once or twice over the last couple months. And I'm just wondering, basically, do I have to throw out several $100s of preserved whole vanilla bean, or is there any way this is still salvageable?
Did you say that they were like vacuum sealed? Was that how you found them?
I'm not sure if they were vacuum sealed, but each one of them is in one of these like sealed plastic tubes that feels like there's a little bit of pressure, but it's been about a month or so since the last time I've seen them.
I see. Look, I think unless they are moldy or they smell particularly off. Vanilla, especially when it's fresh, has a very intense smell. So that's not a sign of anything, in fact, unless it's just freshness. So if they're moldy, then I think that they're no good. But mostly what happens with vanilla is it just dries out. It gets brittle and hard. And it's not that it's bad. It's that you cannot, the bean doesn't have any sort of plumpness in it to be able to split it and get the seeds out. But you can still use them. Basically, I think they're fine. Like vanilla beans are fermented for a decent period before they are like ready to go to market. So, and it's sort of a preserving process. So I don't think that there's unless there's something visually that looks off about them, or they smell sort of like acidic or rancid in any way, I think they're basically fine. And if you find that they are dried out and sort of unusable for getting the beans out, you can just grind them up and make like lots of vanilla sugar with the whole pod. So yeah, I think absolutely go ahead and use them. And it should be fine.
Okay, cool. Great. Thank you. We found quite a treasure trove in there, and we're just trying to keep as much good stuff as we can.
Got it. Yes. And my condolences as well to your partner and to you.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Same to you.
And I'm sure that they can find plenty of recipes in your new cookbook in which to use the vanilla beans.
Yes, definitely.
All right, let's listen. Seattle, you're up.
Hi, thanks. So I have a question around kind of building out a dessert table for Thanksgiving. I know a lot of the traditional desserts are very rich and heavy. And I was curious, Claire, if there's anything that you make that's a little bit less traditional, but that you think goes really well with a Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to focus on fruit desserts for Thanksgiving because the meal is so rich and heavy that I think it's better to have something fruit-based than especially something chocolate, but even like pecan pie, which can be very sweet and also quite rich. So I like fruit desserts. And if you want something that's a little bit lower profile than like an apple pie, a simple apple galette is really nice. It's just like thinner. It's not sort of as, you're just not getting like such a big slice to tackle. And I also like the proportion in a galette of filling to crust a lot better. I also do, just echoing what I said earlier about cranberries, like a cranberry dessert is great for Thanksgiving because it's really acidic. And so it's almost like sort of palate cleansing. So there is actually a recipe in Dessert Person for a cranberry mousse pie that's really, really good. It's made in advance. The filling is super light and super tart. So it's not like you are, it's just not so kind of intensely like rich and filling. So that's a really good one. I think there's so many other kinds of cranberry desserts that you could do as well. If you're looking for something really light, you could do like caramelized pears with just like a little bit of vanilla ice cream, and like throw in a couple ginger snaps. That's like a very, very sort of fruit focused dessert. I mean, pumpkin pie sort of splits the difference because it's a custard pie, but the pumpkin in there is, I think, cutting through some of the dairy and eggs. I'm trying to think of what else I'm gonna do this year. I mean, my Thanksgiving this year is really small, so I think I'm really just doing like a classic apple pie and pumpkin pie, and that's it. But yeah, I think doing a cranberry dessert is really nice because it's going to sort of give you this kind of bright finish to the meal.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So Blaster Kid, I believe you are next in line. Please unmute and ask Claire your question.
Basically, I wanted to ask if you could like give advice on like transitioning to a point to where you don't have to constantly look for recipes to where you can like essentially.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Great question. I do think that a very to a great extent it is just a function of practice and repetition. I think the more that you it's a little paradoxical, but I think the way that you get to not have to need a recipe is to follow a recipe, if that makes sense. Like, because when you follow a recipe, I mean, if you can try to sort of engage a little bit more as you follow a recipe with the overall process on more of a like outline kind of level rather than the minutia of each step, because that's when you start to kind of see patterns. So in my recipes, I give a descriptive line at the beginning of each step, and I put it in bold so that people kind of see what that step is about. And when you kind of just pay attention to the purpose of each step, that's when you kind of start to see the basic order of operations. And that's what's going to teach you about cooking or baking. So it's like if you're making a braise, for example, and you're following the recipe and you're looking at the steps, you can kind of think about it of like, okay, so what's the basic process here? I'm going to season the meat. I'm going to brown it. I'm going to take it out. I'm going to add my aromatics. I'm going to cook those down and some of the fat. And then I'm going to add the meat back in and some liquid. And I'm going to cook it until it's, tender or whatever. So once you kind of understand the base technique and the process that involves, that's when you can start to kind of start to innovate and come up with your own additions or substitutions to the process, and then eventually even just create your own recipe. So I think it's about kind of getting enough practice and comfort with following a recipe where you start to understand not just the how, but the why behind all the steps that you're doing. And that's when And then you can sort of see that in other recipes and think to yourself, okay, I understand what this is telling me to do. I understand the process, and I'm going to kind of do it my own way or put my own spin on it. And so I think the best advice is just to sort of keep doing what you're doing, which is learning how to cook. It starts by following a recipe, and then once you get really comfortable with that and start to kind of be able to see not just the words on the page, but the actual just overall process, that's when you can kind of get away from just, each and every individual step.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck.
Thanks for your question. All right, Quacks, if you could ask your question now, please.
Hi, Claire. You're like the best. I love you so much. But yeah, I have a question for you.
Thanks.
Is there a way to sub European butter for American butter? Because I'm always bouncing back and forth between countries, and there's no American butter in Germany. So how am I supposed to use this when it has a higher fat content?
There's no need to sort of substitute. It's the same ingredient. You can use it completely interchangeably with any recipe that calls for American butter. Just know that with a couple, additional percentage points more of butter fat, you're just going to get a slightly richer flavor. So there's no conversion is what I'm trying to say, really. You're just sort of using an ingredient that's slightly different than the American version, but it shouldn't affect the outcome of the recipe other than just making it taste a little bit better. So there's nothing you have to really worry about. In some cases where the proportion of butter is really particular, you might find that you have a little bit more of a greasy texture. Not that that's a bad thing. So if you're like making chocolate chip cookies, maybe you find that the cookies spread a tiny bit more, or you pick up a cookie and the bottom has a little bit of like a little bit of fat on it. It's just that might happen. But other than that, it's like just enjoy using great butter and use it as you would in any of your recipes, and it'll probably just end up tasting all that much better.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I was really scared because there are like some people in like some pie crust. I don't know. I've tried a bunch of different recipes and they're just like, oh, the pie crust is really greasy. What do I do? And like, I'm really scared to try this now. So yeah, I don't know. I'll just try it next time I go. I was just a little cautious.
There is so much variation just within the US in butter brands that are available here. So you would probably have just as much variation in the US as you would using European butter, unless it was like a very, very special butter, like single. Sometimes you see something called single udder butter, like butter from one cow. That's on some like incredible diet or that kind of thing. I think generally there is so much variation just across the board in butter, no matter where you are, that it's probably worth it for you if you're going to be spending a lot of time in another place to sort of do a little bit of trial and error and see which one you like best and which one gives you the best result, and then just kind of stick with that one.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Of course, you're welcome.
I love you. I bought your book recently.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thanks.
That was a great question, and I just want to second and back you up, Claire, because I'm British. I've made several of your recipes with the butter we get in the UK here, and it's all fine.
Excellent.
I can confirm. So yeah, Cranky Aggie B, I think you are next in line. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Claire your question.
Oh, sorry, let me get out of the kitchen. Frying Lampia. So I am making 2 slab pies for office Thanksgiving parties tomorrow. My pie crust never goes well. It's always either super, super dry or so wet that, it's like it's been set outside in the rain for a couple of days. What can I do to get halfway decent pie crust?
Yeah, I mean, hydration is, I think, there's 2 sort of keys to successful pie dough. One is temperature, so keeping everything cold, and 2 is hydration, so adding just enough moisture to bind all the flour and to make a cohesive, uniform dough, but not so much that you are then developing lots of gluten and then you're getting something a little bit tough. I mean, I think generally if it had to go in one direction, it's better to have it be a little too wet than a little too dry, because the drier it is, the more it will crack as you roll it out, and that can be really, really frustrating. If you find that it's cracking a lot as you roll because it's dry, I like to keep a little bit of a spray bottle of water in my kitchen. So what you can do is basically give it like a little spritz all over, and then basically fold it back up and kind of like pat it back into a circle, and then chill it again for a couple hours and let it absorb that extra moisture. I mean, it's a little bit of extra moisture goes quite a long way. So there's that. I mean, as far as it being too wet, it's like you're just adding too much moisture at the beginning, and then it's just sort of overhydrating as it sits. And it's always going to, as it chills in the fridge, that hydration is going, like it will continue to hydrate. And so sometimes even if it looks dry going into the fridge, it will hydrate as it sits. So I mean, you're kind of operating on two extremes. So maybe you're afraid it's going to be dry, and so you're overcompensating by adding more liquid. I mean, there's a method in What's for Dessert for bringing together pie dough that I think really helps dial in the hydration. Even if you don't have the book, you can find the method, because I did a video with King Arthur Flour. It's on their YouTube channel of how I put together that pie dough. So check it out, and you can take a look, and you can really apply that technique to any like recipe that you find, because it's not really so much about the recipe. It's about, that process of adding the liquid and how to bring it all together. So if you haven't already made the pastry, I would just take a look at it and try following it and see what happens. But also take notes. Like if you are making the recipe, take note of how much water you're adding for a batch. Make note of the flour brand you're using, the butter brand you're using, and then the next time you make it, you can and also make sure you're weighing your ingredients. That's a really important thing. If you are having variable amounts of flour, then it's going to make it really hard from batch to batch to know sort of what's the right amount of water. So, I mean, lots of like little things like that, but I do think it's tricky for people, and even for people who don't bake like regularly, they tend to then bake on Thanksgiving, and then and making pie dough is something that gets better the more you do it. So it just
pie crust is kind of my downfall in the baking world.
It can be tricky. So yeah, I would say follow all those tips, and best of luck. I mean, slab pies also can be difficult because you're having to roll out like really large pieces of pastry. So but good luck, and let me know how it goes.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Truman the Pug, you're up now.
Awesome. Claire, fangirling virtually over here. Love all of your work and all of your videos. I, for better or worse, usually fall asleep to them if I'm trying to catch some geese or get a recipe going, but that's just, your voice is so soothing in those.
Great.
Question for you is, hot debate in our family and just with my boyfriend as well. When can you use a canned item versus a frozen item, and when should you go all out and buy it fresh?
So what's an example of like the what would be the item, and what would be the canned versus fresh versus frozen?
So specifically, I guess in baking, like any of the berry stuff, we always come to a hit topic on. He loves cherry pie, and he's like, you must go buy cherries and pit them. And I'm like, can I just use a can of them?
I see. Okay, so in most fruit desserts, not most, but in many fruit desserts, you can use a frozen version. The problem with using frozen, it's not inherently worse. And sometimes using frozen is better. Like I actually recommend that people use frozen blueberries instead of fresh, because you can get really high quality, for example, frozen Maine blueberries. They taste great. And if you're making a pie, frozen is really helpful because they keep the crust cold, and so it increases your work time. So that's one example where I actually think frozen is a better option. Where frozen tends to sometimes be a problem is just because it's not always ripe. I've really experienced this a lot with frozen mango, because there's a recipe in What's for Dessert that uses frozen mango, and there is such an incredible variation in brands of frozen mango. Like some of it is just so incredibly unripe, your dessert won't taste like anything because unripe mango doesn't have a ton of flavor. But then there are certain brands, there's like one Trader Joe's brand that actually has really nice ripe frozen mango. So it's not even so much about the rule of like frozen is always better or fresh is always better. It's just so kind of dependent on the circumstance. So if it's winter and you want to make cherry pie, like, yeah, go with frozen. But I think your boyfriend's point might just be more about like freshness and ripeness and seasonality and that kind of thing. So in most cases, you can use frozen for the fresh. and it's okay, but just know that just because you're not in control of the ripeness and you're not selecting that fruit yourself, it might not like live up to the expectation. As far as canned, usually a canned fruit has sugar added for preserving, and or it's cooked in some way. So it's not, I can't reliably say that's like a decent substitute if you're making a fruit dessert. You would have to try it and see. There are canned, if you're wanting to do sour cherry, there are canned sour cherries in like light syrup, and that makes like an okay pie. You don't quite get the same vibrancy of flavor and texture as you would from using fresh. So it's not so much a hard and fast rule. I think if you decide that you want to make something and you want to use frozen fruit because you don't have access to fresh, or it's just a convenience thing, I would say go ahead and try it and then kind of be your own judge about like if that was sort of acceptable. But there isn't, depending on the fruit, like theoretically, yes, you can use frozen instead.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, that's a really handy explanation, Claire, because I always struggle with the same issue. So let's continue on. I think Sed Non Satiata, I think you are next in line if you want to unmute yourself and ask Claire your question.
All right. So first of all, I'm a great fan. Hi from Sweden. So my question is the following. I was really looking forward to purchase your book, Dessert Person. But I've been reading quite a few, comments on Reddit, especially, and people have been having a little bit of a hit and miss experience with the recipes in the book. And some people have said even that they seem kind of like not completely tested through. And especially the coffee cake, which I was really looking forward to make, seems to be a little bit of a hit or miss with people who have purchased the book. So I was wondering if you can, if you've got wind of that kind of comment, and what's your response to that?
Are you referring to Dessert Person? Because that's the book where coffee cake is from.
Yes.
I see. I've talked to many people who've made that particular recipe, and I haven't come across anyone that didn't have luck with it. I think anyone that understands my process or knows me or watches the videos knows that I do test recipes quite thoroughly. But it is impossible to account for every variable in the kitchen because people's ovens and cookware and ingredients and weather and elevation, all of these things affect outcomes of recipes. And I just don't have, it's just not practical. And I certainly don't have the resources to be able to test and account for every single variable that will affect the outcome of a recipe. So very often I find that if a recipe doesn't turn out, it might not be the fault of the maker or the recipe, but the cookware in particular can have quite a dramatic effect on the outcome. So I do want to assure you that everything is as thoroughly tested as possible and as is sort of practical and within my realm of possibility. So yeah, I hear occasionally about a recipe not turning out, and I always sort of want to speak to that person and try to figure it out. And sometimes it is a variable that is out of both their and my control. So all I can say is, I do the best that I can under the circumstances. I often test a recipe in 2 different places, in 2 different kitchens with different cookware, different ovens. But, it's just inevitable that as thoroughly as a recipe is tested, there are many reasons why it may or may not turn out for anyone in particular. But I do know people that have made the coffee cake several times, and it's and I even heard from someone recently that it's like they're one of their family's favorite recipes. So when it turns out for one person and not another, it's just sort of hard to say what I like to sort of be able to talk to someone and sort of figure it out, but it's really hard for me to sort of say what could have happened. But yeah, I think if anyone is in doubt about the recipes being tested, I assure you things are tested as thoroughly as I possibly can.
Right, then I'm gonna get it for Christmas then. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Speaking for myself, I love Dessert Person, and everything has worked perfectly for me. And it's not Dessert Person recipe, but I'm making the potato gratin recipe for my Thanksgiving because I've made it a million times and I love it. So I just love your recipes.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have M. Hankey. If you could please ask your question.
Hi, Claire. We actually just made your lemon Meyer bundt cake for dessert last night, and we served it to a big group of friends, and it was a big hit. So thank you.
Amazing. Yay. Thanks.
My question is, I suppose, in a little bit of a similar vein to testing the recipes. How do you decide which recipes do or don't make the cut for the books that you've released?
Yeah, there's so many questions and variables that go into not just a recipe making it into the book, but like where that recipe appears and the order and like its placement within the chapter. And so there's sort of like both tangible and intangible qualities that I look for in a recipe. I want the recipe, especially for what's for dessert, where the focus is so much on streamlined processes and kind of a more like stripped down, simpler approach. It had to sort of satisfy that. It had to have that quality to it. Like that was an important piece of criteria for a recipe to go into the book, is that it just couldn't feel fussy or elaborate. It's just so in some ways that's both tangible and intangible, because it's not going to use a stand mixer. It's not going to involve lots of different hard to find ingredients. It's not going to generate a ton of dishes. So there was that part of it. And then there's also just kind of the part where it's like, it has to feel like a recipe that I would make. It has to be something I like to eat, that I would make over and over again. And sometimes I make a recipe that I like eating it, but there's just nothing that's particularly special about it. There is nothing that distinguishes it from another recipe you might be able to find elsewhere. So that's the part where I kind of have to think, like, does this represent my point of view? Is this something that I make? Does it feel like there's something clever or something that I'm delivering with this recipe that, someone couldn't find in a recipe that was similar? So all of these things kind of go into it. And, sometimes I go back and forth. Like there's a couple recipes in What's for Dessert that were kind of so unfamiliar to me. I kind of questioned if I should include them or not. But then I also like to think about, like, well, this recipe, is this delivering like a useful product for people? Is this something that does this sort of satisfy the needs of someone, in the kitchen? So that goes into it as well. So yeah, it's sort of an imprecise process. And my editor as well, weighs in, and she might point something out like, hey, I don't really think this goes in this chapter, or this doesn't feel like the other ones, or maybe this is too complicated, or that kind of thing. We went back and forth about whether or not there should be donuts in What's for Dessert, because they're, I'm focusing on simpler stuff and they're deep fried. And she was like, can you really say that a deep fried recipe is simple? So we had our own kind of debate about it. And I said, she kind of acquiesced when I made the argument that, like, but there is something about the actual recipes themselves that feels simpler and approachable. And, I'm going to give lots of guidance for people at home about how to deep fry safely. So, it's always sort of open for discussion. So it's an interesting process for sure.
Awesome. Thanks for the thoughtful answer. We love the book so far. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Yay.
Thanks. That was a great question. Ravenelle, I think it was your turn to ask a question next.
Okay, I have two questions. One is, I think I noticed in the video that, Claire, you're also left-handed. So I was wondering if that, there are any specific things that you would, like, any specific challenges or things you notice as, like, a left-handed person when you're baking desserts and such. And the other question I have is, do you have any tips on rolling out doughs or pastries and stuff like that? Because if I ever watch videos, it doesn't really show the process of rolling out something. And then in books, usually it just says roll out. But then whenever I do that, I never get like a regular rectangular shape or a perfect circle. It's always like uneven, or I feel like I'm pushing out stuff that, like, butter in the dough just gets pushed out when I try to roll it. So I don't know what to do to help with that. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I am left-handed, and there actually, in my family, there's 5 members of my immediate family. 3 of us are left-handed. So it seemed very normal to me. And then I got to culinary school and everything was right-handed. And there were certain processes, not so much for pastry, but for just cooking in general, where like the side you do it on matters. So like filleting fish, I had to just switch everything because it was like it's weirdly like a right-handed thing, the way that they teach it. It's not a huge challenge in the kitchen. There are certain little tools that are more right-handed than left. So certain scissors and certain knives, even because of the way that the blade, the side that it's sharpened on, determines if it's for righties or lefties. So, but generally, it's not a big issue. The main thing was just in culinary school, if they were teaching a particular technique and it would be on with one hand, I would have to sort of mentally switch it. And yeah, so okay, so as far as rolling out dough, it's a really good question. I do have in the final chapter in What's for Dessert, I go really in depth into lots of different techniques, and one of the techniques is how to roll out dough. Because I totally get your question. It's like you're glossing over a lot if it just says like roll out dough into a 12-inch round or that kind of thing. So if you're making something, if you're rolling out like a flaky pastry or any kind of tart dough or pie dough, that's butter based. One initial step that I like to do is to beat the dough lightly with a rolling pin, not so hard that you're going to like shatter it or break it apart, but enough to make an indentation. And what that tends to do is it tends to make the butter pliable, but before it has a chance to warm up so it doesn't get sticky. So that will help to sort of create this kind of malleability in the dough while it's still cold, because one of the most important things is that any kind of dough, any kind of pastry dough stays cold as you roll it. So that's the first thing. Actually, backing up even before you roll out the dough, just one really helpful tip that I tell people is whatever the shape of the dough is before it goes into the fridge to chill, that is the shape it's going to want to be when you roll it out. So if you are putting a round of dough into the fridge, but then you're trying to roll it out into a square, it's going to be a little bit tricky because it's just going to want to be round. So try whatever shape you're going for, whether it's a round or a rectangle, have it be the shape of the pastry once you put it in the fridge before you roll it out. So that's kind of thing number one. Number two is that beating lightly of the dough all around. And again, sort of if you're going for a round, you can kind of rotate the dough as you beat it. If you're going for a rectangle, you kind of do it lengthwise and then crosswise, because what you want to do is kind of orient the gluten structure in the shape that you want it to be. I also like to move the dough around quite a bit as I roll. So keeping it moving on the surface helps to prevent sticking. And you want to make sure that as you roll, the dough is able to glide over the surface. So you're adding flour as needed. And another thing, if you're doing any kind of laminated dough, which you might be doing because you were talking about how sometimes the butter like squeezes out, remember that you're not really pressing down. It's more of a pushing away from you. So think about that dough gliding across the surface, and rather than kind of pressing down hard, straight down onto the surface. So all those tips should help. If you're interested, you can, if you have What's for Dessert, you can kind of take a look at the process in the back. There's photos that give you a step-by-step, but try using those tips and see if it helps at all.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Okay, Palmetto, there we go.
I'm smoking a brisket for Thanksgiving, and I was like trying to think of a good rub for it. Like, what would you throw in it besides like the normal salt and pepper? Just something to give it a little zing.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, the classic rub is sort of like paprika, chili powder, a little bit of cumin. I love coriander. I mean, this is sort of like, barbecue flavors. Also, I think it's what's really important in anything that's smoked, I think, is a little bit of sugar. Brown sugar, I think, is a really kind of crucial ingredient in getting that color on the outside and that bark. I mean, I should just say I'm so not like a smoked meat expert at all when it comes to making it. It's really a cooking process that I'm like, pretty inexperienced with because it just requires such a setup that I don't have. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of flavors that might also go really well with Thanksgiving. So if you can, maybe some certain dried herbs, like some dried thyme might be nice. I don't know what happens to those flavors if they're exposed to smoke, even at like low temperatures over time. So you might do like a little Googling to see if that's recommended to incorporate any kind of dried herbs into the rub. So maybe just kind of staying in that like classic paprika, a little brown sugar, salt, pepper, that kind of thing is probably pretty safe territory.
Yeah, I was like thinking some brown sugar and maybe some pineapple juice. Throw it on there. See what happens.
Let me know. I'm not sure. I mean, I know pineapple juice is interesting because it has an enzyme in it. I think it's called it's like papillase or something like that. That will break down meat, and so it's like a tenderizer. So that could be, I don't know. I would say play around with it, see what you can find, do a little research. But yeah, good luck. Let me know how it turns out.
All right, thank you.
Geo 5050, it's your turn. You've been waiting patiently. Please unmute yourself and ask Claire your question.
Awesome. All right. Massive fan. Been like watching since the beginning of the Gourmet Makes series. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. I have two questions for you. First one, like, it's about your hair. I've always been super curious about like the silver strip in your hair. Like, how long have you been doing it? Like, at first I thought it was like just in your hair. I'm like, there's no way she's that old that she has silver in her hair already. So just thought I'd ask about it.
Yeah, so I've been growing, it's genetic. It runs in my family. I don't put it there. I've been turning gray since I was in my early 20s. My mom has the same thing. I have two older sisters. We all have the same thing, but it comes in differently for each of us. So I just naturally have this kind of patch in the front. And actually I have it all over, but it's just harder to see. Like the patch in the front is more concentrated. So yeah, it's just genetic. It's like it's not really a function of age. It's just everyone in my family kind of has it. And I did dye my hair when I was like in my 20s, but I just got so sick of it and was like, I don't care about this. Like, it's just, I kind of embraced it like starting several years ago, and I'm so glad I did because it's just not worth it to me. I just don't. It's not important to me to keep it looking any particular way. So yeah, it's mostly out of just being low maintenance, but I'm kind of glad that it has a kind of a cool pattern to it. And like people talk, remark upon it, strangers, that kind of thing. So yeah, it kind of became like my thing, which is funny, but really I just didn't feel like dyeing it anymore.
I was just curious about your relationship with everybody like at Bon Appetit. Like, I definitely, your friendship or like the relationships that you guys had over there at the test kitchen was, I thought, just friendship goals, especially you and Brad. So I was just curious if you guys like kept in touch or if you guys are friends in real life.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the years since 2020, everyone's kind of gone and scattered. Like, Brad has moved, like several of us have moved. So we keep in touch. I haven't really had the chance to see anyone in person recently, but we definitely all keep in touch. I'd be happy to see my friends from the test kitchen in the future. But it's been exciting to see what everyone has kind of done in those last couple of years. Yeah, I mean, like, lots of books have been written. It's been really exciting. So yeah, I think like it's, when you're not with someone every day, the way that I worked with all these people for so many years, their relationship definitely changes. But I think everyone sort of has a soft spot in their in their hearts for one another.
Great answer. All right, Calligraphy, it's your turn to ask your question.
So my question is, I have extremely limited sort of like cooking utensils. I have one oven-safe pan. It's like a 7x11 rectangular metal thing that was just in my apartment. How much does the size and shape of a pan really matter when it comes to baking things?
I'm sorry to tell you, it matters quite a lot. It's just it really does. What color is the pan, if you may?
It's like a dark gray nonstick, I think, sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, nonstick is tricky. So generally speaking, the lighter the color, like an aluminum pan, that tends to give you more even baking. So it's not just the dimensions, but it's also the material can be really, really important. So I tend to recommend anodized aluminum or any aluminum pan if possible, because you'll get the most even baking. A dark pan tends to absorb heat really, really quickly, and so it can really easily overcook something. So if you're making like a yellow cake, you'll find that the center might be underdone, but you get really dark sides and bottom, and that can be the result of cooking in a dark pan. The height of the sides can also make a big difference. So if you're making a cake, if you have really low sides, it tends to you tend to get less of a rise out of the cake. So the higher, that's why I often recommend pans with like at least 2-inch sides, because you'll get just a lighter, fluffier cake. And this has to do with sort of how the like heat radiates and conducts like across the surface from the sides. So, it's just every recipe that I make is sort of particularly like engineered for that a particular size pan, and there are ways that you can substitute a pan size for another. So sometimes if a cake is baked in a 9-inch round, you can very easily also bake that same recipe, that same quantity in a loaf pan, but the cook time will be a little bit different because you are decreasing the amount of surface area. So, there's going to be sort of less heat transfer in the same amount of time. So you're going to have to bake it for a little bit longer. So pans are so important. It's such a big variable in baking. So I would say over time, if you're able to kind of slowly add to your collection of cookware and kind of start with the pieces that are going to give you the most mileage, like a basic 9-inch cake pan or a springform pan or a loaf pan, and go for things that are light colored. And generally, I generally feel like there's no point to nonstick cookware because one, the coating can flake off, which isn't so great. That's not something you really want to be eating in your food. And also you can always use parchment paper. So parchment kind of, I think, removes the need for anything nonstick. So yeah, I would say over time, kind of if you can slowly build your collection or inherit things or borrow from a neighbor, but the pan is quite important.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
I did not expect that it would be such a scientific thing, but that
Yes.
makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
From scientific to mathematic, we've got mathematician West. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Claire your question.
Okay, well, of course, I'm an admirer of all you do, all your work. I recently got the What's for Dessert book in the mail. It's beautiful. I'm trying to decide which recipe to tackle first, and I wanted to know when you were developing the recipes, which was your favorite, but more importantly, which one was something that maybe typically you wouldn't enjoy or eat, and ended up actually surprising you.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my personal favorites in the book is the tiramisu icebox cake, which I've already talked about quite a bit, just in like talking about the books since it came out. I love coffee. If I'm not having a fruit dessert, I want to have a coffee dessert because I just love coffee. Is like one of the most incredible flavors I could, just of anything I've ever tasted. And that dessert does so much with texture. It's just so light and creamy, but it has great clarity of flavor and balance, and just one of my favorites. It also has, the store-bought ingredient, which is just the ladyfingers, which is just like makes your life so easy. So I feel like it is not only the kind of thing I want to eat and I love eating and I love the flavor and texture, but it also I think it is a good recipe that delivers on the promise of the book, which is impressive looking and delicious, but simple recipes. So that's one. Sorry, the other part of your question was, I got so involved talking about tiramisu icebox cake. The other question was about, remind me.
Kind of which one was maybe something you typically wouldn't eat?
Oh, yes. Okay.
You did.
Yes, thank you.
That's okay.
There's like a whole category of pudding that I never made or cared about eating very much. I think really prior to testing the pudding recipes in this book, I associated pudding with snack packs, like the chocolate little containers of store-bought pudding. But I love pastry cream, which is essentially pudding. So pudding is like a stirred custard cooked on the stovetop. It's thickened with not only eggs, but a starch of some kind, usually cornstarch. And I had so much fun both making and eating the puddings in the book that I was like, wow, this might be one of my new favorite categories of dessert. So there's the chocolate coupes, which is just an assembled kind of parfait of pudding and whipped cream and crumbled up chocolate cookies. There is the banoffee pudding, which is like a banana. It's like a banana dulce de leche pudding that's layered with biscuits and whipped sour cream and more dulce de leche. It's so good. There's a malted and salted caramel pudding, which just is so creamy and the flavor is so intense. And just you have this luxurious silky texture. So that was a surprise. I was like, oh, I love pudding. What an interesting and they're so fun and easy to make. So I've been telling everyone about the pudding recipes in the book because they're so good, and that was sort of a surprise to me.
Well, good. I will definitely try that. I'm not a big pudding eater. pudding eater either, but going through the book, I was like, wow, these look amazing. So I'll definitely give those a try. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think for pudding, it's like the only thing about pudding is that it can be very one note because it's just a lot of the same texture and it's very soft. So to me, the trick is just like put a little whipped cream on it, put a little crumble of something so you get some crunch, and then it makes eating it like much more enjoyable and just super delicious.
I will definitely do that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Okay, Pins and Ladders, it's your turn if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, of course, super huge fan. I recently made your caramelized pumpkin pie for a Friendsgiving. It tasted great, but when I was par baking the crust, I got a really large like bubble of air between the layers of the pastry. I was able to like pop it mid-bake and fortunately get it to like kind of calm down, but I'm wondering, I have to make it again this week for another Thanksgiving, and I'm wondering maybe what I did that I can try to avoid next time.
Yeah, par baking is a really technical, tricky process. I think it is, and this is what I tell people on Thanksgiving, is it's like people who are attempting, this is not related to you, but just generally like people who don't bake and then decide to bake at Thanksgiving. I'm like, you are picking a very, very challenging technical thing to do, which is to par bake, which is, the process that you do for any kind of custard based pie. I'm a firm believer in par baking because if you have unbaked pastry and then you add a liquidy filling to it, there is no way that you're going to get that pastry baked as much as it needs to be baked. So I commend you on going through the whole process. One of the best things you can do is just dock the pastry. So just pricking the bottom of the pastry when it's cold with the tines of a fork or just the point of a paring knife. And that creates little escape points for moisture, which comes from the pastry and from the butter. And it's that moisture turning into steam that's creating that puffing. I mean, it's actually a good sign because to me, it means that you probably have like very flaky pastry. So the flakier the pastry, the more likely you are to have that kind of puffing and that separation of the layers. But yes, but you are correct. Like then it makes it a little trickier for the filling. It's not so much a problem. I think docking it should help to correct that issue. But if you are having the problem that it creates is that it might make like little fissures or cracks in the pastry, and then when you go to pour in the filling, it might leak. But one of the best things that you can do to prevent that is pour your filling in the crust while it's super hot, like right out of the oven. I think people think that they have to let it cool, but I actually prefer to pour my filling into right out of the oven par baked pastry because that heat from the pastry will do a couple things. One, it will help to just cook the filling a lot faster. So if you pour filling into a room temp pastry, it's going to bake for quite a long time. But into a hot pastry, the whole thing kind of comes up to temperature and will bake a lot more quickly. It also tends to set that custard filling as soon as it hits the pastry because it's so hot. So it basically cooks it on that very, very bottom layer. And then it prevents leaking. So that's that's not really going to correct the issue of puffing. That the best way to prevent that is just by docking the pastry. But if you do have any cracks in your crust, pouring the filling in while it's hot will also prevent any leaking. So it sounds like you're on the right track. But yeah, just give it some pricks with a fork. And if it does puff up, just do what you did before, like press it down with a spoon and just keep going.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
I've also made your caramelized, torched kind of pumpkin pie, I think about 3 times for Thanksgiving, and it's so good.
Amazing. Yay.
Yeah. So I think we have one more person. I know we're up to 10 o'clock, but as we started a little late, Claire, I hope you don't mind. We have another person on stage that can ask a question. So just to finish that off. More espresso, please. Would you like to unmute and ask Claire your question?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. So I'm a huge fan. Claire, you actually really inspired a lot of my baking and learning how to bake. So thank you for that. This year, I kind of have a challenge. My stepdad last year was diagnosed with alpha-gal, which is a tick-borne disease that makes him allergic to dairy and to red meat. So my family, as I am the honorary baker of the family, has challenged me to make a dairy-free pie. So I'm just wondering if you've ever made that before, attempted that before, if you have any ideas. I'm leaning towards an apple pie, but I just want to know if you had any ideas or tips.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to hear that about you said it was your stepfather? It was?
Yeah, my stepdad.
Okay, I see. Okay, yeah, I mean, the good news is that taking dairy out of baking is not such a tremendous feat. It would be much more difficult to remove eggs. I think like as long as eggs are in the mix, dairy-free, gluten-free, these things are very doable. I think apple pie is a good choice because you're not opting for a custard filling where like dairy is sort of an essential component, although you still could do custard with it that's dairy-free. So really it comes down to replacing the butter in the crust, because other than that, a normal apple pie, kind of a typical American apple pie is not going to have other dairy with it. So there's a couple different options for replacing the butter in crust. I can't say this from direct experience, but I know people who've had great success just using vegan butter as a substitute for regular butter in a crust. I'm not so experienced with vegan butters, but I've heard from many people that actually is a pretty good substitute. So you get similar, like the flavor is similar, and you get kind of the same textural effect with that puffing and the separation and everything. So there's that option. Dessert Person has an olive oil pastry in it, so oil-based rather than butter-based. It does give you a little bit of flakiness and tenderness. It's not going to be the same texture as like a all butter pie crust, but it will. I think it'll get the job done. So other than that, I would just say try looking up some reliable sources for vegan pastry. I always point people in the direction of this recipe developer and pastry chef named Erin Goyoaga. She is based in Seattle, and she has her blog is Canelle Vanille, and she does like lots of vegan and gluten-free baking. So I would say check out her pastry dough recipe and see what she calls for that's non-dairy. I believe it's vegan. And I would say like anything that she recommends, I'd say is like she's like a great tester and like big following. So like lots of people kind of weighing in and helping her refine the techniques and everything. So it's really just about replacing the butter. And I think that it's like very doable. So yeah, I would do a little bit of research, check out that resource, and best of luck.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
And a great question to end our Reddit talk with you, Claire. I just want to thank all the listeners for tuning in, and for those who asked questions for their great questions. We've run out of time for any more, sadly. But Claire, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about your new cookbook that's just been released, and where they can find it, and where they can find more about you if they so wish?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate everyone that tuned in and for asking a question. It's always fun to talk about baking, especially now, given that it's like, so close to such a baking focused holiday. So my new book, which came out November 8th, is called What's for Dessert? And it is a book filled with over 100 recipes for pretty simple, streamlined desserts, but desserts of every kind, from frozen and chilled desserts to stovetop desserts. There is no stand mixer required, so all the recipes are really makeable and accessible. So I think there's something in the book for everyone. It can suit every kind of taste, but also time, budget, kitchen setup, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really excited about it, and it's available wherever you would normally buy books. I believe it's available. I have to check the date, but it will be available in the UK and Australia as well. I think on the 20, like what is today? I think today. Oh my gosh. I think it might come out today in the UK and Australia. So yeah, check it out. And thank you so much to everyone for coming.
It's 100% on my Christmas wish list. So that's
wonderful.
Great. So if anyone wants to hear more from me or Meg, you can listen to us. We have a podcast. We're on Pod Appétit Gourmet Takes. No surprises for where we got our name from, where we were inspired by. But you can find us on all your normal podcatchers or podcast platforms. Or you can go to podappetitpodcast.com, and we release episodes every other Monday. So we actually have another Reddit talk that we'll be hosting very soon. It's the run-up to Thanksgiving continues on our food with a Molly Bar. Molly is actually collecting questions for that talk in advance. There is a link on the pinned post in the Our Food subreddit. So please do submit your Thanksgiving hotline questions there. And that about wraps it up. So thank you again so much, Claire. It's been so great to hear your answers and to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Claire. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Pod Appétit Gourmet Takes.
We'd love to hear from you, so find us on Twitter and Instagram at pod_appétit.
And on Facebook at Pod Appétit Podcast.
You can also email us at podappetitpodcast@gmail.com and find all of our episodes on our website, podappetitpodcast.com.